Hello everyone, this is Lance. I'd like to talk about my design process for the custom UI themes I make. Usually, whenever I post one of these custom UI themes, one of the most frequently asked questions I get is about how I made these. Some people think I modified the game files, but I created it entirely using Photoshop and Illustrator. Many people also like to ask me where the assets for my custom UI themes come from, such as whether they're official assets or materials I make myself. Anyway, I'll try to cover all of that in this video. I'd like to explain the entire process in detail, starting from analyzing the event itself, to planning the visual direction, creating new assets, and finally integrating all the elements into a complete UI theme. I'll use the theme I recently created for Bolívar Diagnosed as an example. Now, whenever I decide to make a new theme, my first question isn't what should it look like? Instead, I ask, what is this event trying to communicate? Or, in other words, what kind of story is it trying to tell? Because every Arknights event has its own visual identity and its own story. Just like how Lone Trail doesn't feel like Babel and Babel doesn't feel like Swirling Surma in Herbs. So, before opening Photoshop or Illustrator, I spent a lot of time carefully studying the event itself, like reading the story first. After all, creating this type of UI theme isn't really just about making something that looks like Arknights. You need to understand the reasons behind Arknights' design decisions and then apply the same design language to your own. Usually, a lot of these design decisions are obviously related to the event's setting, characters, plot, and so on. Next, I don't immediately look for assets to copy, and instead I look for recurring elements first. For example, what kinds of shapes keep appearing? Are these mostly circles, rectangles, or diagonal lines? Is the overall atmosphere modern and sleek, or dark and gothic theme? What kinds of effects appear most frequently in the interface? These observations will ultimately become the design guidelines for the entire team. Once I feel like I've absorbed enough of the event's visual language, only then do I start designing. Let's take this event, Bolívar Diagnosed, as an example. Firstly, I gathered references of the event's graphic design. Starting with the BV, I also saved the promotional graphics, event infographics, and so on in one folder. Then I usually paste all these images down on one Illustrator file to easily look at them one by one. Basically, I use it as a sort of digital cardboard. You can also use an app like PureRef, which is free for personal use and has multiple features, such as an infinitely expandable canvas and an always on top mode. However, I find it more convenient to use Illustrator since I often find myself drawing on top of the references or tracing some of the assets. Speaking of asset tracing, I think this is also a fairly common thing that Arknights designers do. So for example, here we have the stage background from Here People Shows. If you can see here, we have some nice texture work going on. This is actually sourced from Pinterest. I'll pull up the page here for you on the screen. And let me just copy and paste this down here. And if I just rotate it a little bit and turn down the transparency, here you can see it's just the same texture. And actually, a lot of the graphic design in Arknights, a lot of its inspiration comes from Pinterest. So here I also have a pin that looks very similar to the graphic design of the Masses Travels. And here I'll also have Destiny 2. And you can see the same eye symbol being used in one of the events that Arknights has released. And here, even in the recent IS7, we also have some strikingly similar pins And it's safe to say that if you want to be a good designer, you need to be able to browse Pinterest. So, how exactly should one go about browsing Pinterest? Well, for Arknights, if we want to trace their source of inspiration, specifically the pins on Pinterest that likely inspired them, we first need to understand the background setting of the event. Take Lone Trail for example. It draws heavily from the space race era of the 1960s, a period that culminated in the historic Apollo 11 mission, which successfully landed humans on the moon. Once we've established the historical context of Lone Trail, we can easily identify a few key terms. Since it's the 1960s, words like retro and mid-century modern naturally come into mind. If you combine these words together and search it up on Pinterest, you'll eventually stumble upon a pin labeled as Modern Retro Graphic Design. Not only does its color palette bear a striking resemblance to the logo of Lone Trail, even the font is exactly the same, specifically ITC Avant-Garde. Furthermore, the original source predates Lone Trail by several years, appearing in Google search results as early as 2016. In short, it's just as Sun Tzu once said, good design is just copying others on Pinterest. Now, let's try applying the same method to the Bolívar Diagnose event. A quick look at the event's key visual reveals numerous medically related elements such as hospital beds, surgical lights, and diagnostic imaging. In short, the setting of Bolívar Diagnose is obviously related to medical diagnosis. Consequently, if we look up diagnostic imaging on Pinterest, we'll quickly be able to find references that closely match the graphic design style of this event. By the way, for my Chinese or Japanese viewers, I recommend you search up their keywords in English specifically. When we put this event's graphic design side by side with this pin, for example, you'll be able to find details that closely match each other, such as the white inner glow effect along the edges and the deep blue tones at the center. In fact, there are also other elements that match the graphic design of Bolívar Diagnose, such as this rectangular gradient, which clearly appears to have been inspired by this pin. Next, I'll try to replicate the effects that Arknights uses in their graphic design for this event, while following their same design process as closely as possible. Okay, so now here I have the Bolívar Diagnose UI I've made. Let's go into one of the buttons here. So here I've attempted to replicate the effect of the event's graphic design style. And to replicate this effect, it uses inner glow, about 2 layers of inner glow. So the base layer is colored dark blue, and then the second inner glow, which is applied on top of it, is colored blue. Well, it's almost cyan. And then there's another inner glow which is white. The other ones here, for this one here, this is actually inner shadow, because I lowered the fill opacity for this layer, so only stacked inner shadows will work, since I can't stack inner glows. And let's talk about the font here. So in Bolívar Diagnose, there's also 2 fonts. Of course, there's the normal font, the source hand serif or 四眼松体, and we also have Cormorant, which is available on Google Fonts. And this font here is actually I attempted to trace this font first because I didn't know this was an actual font. Because Hypergriff usually they make their own custom font, so I never expected that this was an actual font. The name of this font is Arknights from the Arknights manuscript, or well, based off on. And this is actually the font of IS7, the black flow of the drowning seekers. And before someone asks why I use the IS7 font for Bolívar Diagnose, even though it's not the same event, it's because I like the font, so I just wanted to use it. And here we also have the background here. The background is also an inner glow. There's some variation, like you see here. The inner glow is darker here and brighter here. This is achieved by brightness and contrast layers. So here's without the brightness, so it's all uniform. And this is with the brightness and contrast layers. So the brightness and contrast layers, I added a layer mask to make it uneven. And there's also a curves layer, so it's darker when it's dark and brighter when it's bright. And for the text here, I also have, this is actually chromatic aberration, but it's not true. Chromatic aberration usually appears in old CRT TVs. So basically it's very fitting for this event, since this event is about exploration into unknown territory. And even the promotional trailer, it also uses an old camera. But there's also some tips and bits here. This is actually from a displacement map, but for the chromatic aberration, it's achieved using drop shadows and an outer glow to make it darker. And for the text having dark gray gradients with a white inner glow, it's of course an inner glow effect with the gradient. So this is the dark gradient. The color of the text is white. I added a dark gradient on top of it and a white inner glow on top of that. Also, this blurred effect for the icon, this is actually achieved using the blur gallery. So if you use the blur gallery, I use field blur, so you can just make some parts of it blurry and parts of it not blurry by modifying the pins. Okay, I think that's about everything I wanted to cover in this video. If you guys have any more questions or suggestions, you can join my group or my server.
再见。